It was a bitter Toronto winter, the kind that makes the city hold its breath. On the morning of January 21st, 1985, a worried mother climbed the narrow stairs to her daughter's apartment and found the door unlocked. Inside, the scene that met her was a violent rupture in a life that, to the outside world, had always looked comfortably contained. Nancy Eaton was only 23. An heiress, yes, but also someone friends described as kind, warm, the kind of person who would treat a younger acquaintance like a little brother. That small ordinary kindness would become the hinge on which tragedy turned. What happened in that apartment would shock a family and a nation. Nancy had been brutally attacked, stabbed multiple times, and sexually assaulted. The person who would admit to the killing was not a stranger. Tonight we tell the story of Nancy Eaton, how a life threaded through wealth and social expectation ended in violence, how a friendship became fatal, and how a justice system wrestled with the messy, painful intersection of mental illness and moral responsibility. Nancy Alice Edward Eaton was born on May 28, 1961, into a family that had loomed large in Toronto life for more than a century, the Eatons. The department stores, the name that meant something to the generations of Canadians. She grew up with public fascination around her family, and as she moved into adulthood, she lived in that peculiar space where public legacy and private life meet. Visible, privileged, and under quiet expectation. But she was more than a name on an invitation list. Friends called her generous. She loved music and social evenings. She spent summers at cottage country near Lake Russell, the kind of place where families pass each other on docks and children learn to swim and in passing form friendships that last years. One of those friendships was with a boy from a neighboring family, a teenager who would grow into a troubled young man, Ernest John Andrew Lation Hughes. Their families were both well known in Toronto circles. Their lives had brushed close long before the crime. In the ordinary rhythm of summer cottages and city social life, Nancy had become someone Andrew trusted. She had helped him, given him shelter at times, treated him like a younger brother. These small details, cottages, borrowed sweaters, favors exchanged, are the texture of the world Nancy inhabited. If you chart a friendship, it's tempting to mark only the bright spots, shared laughs, late coffees, long drives. But friendships can also contain imbalance, dependency, or in rare cases, troubling asymmetrics. With Nancy and Andrew, the disparity wasn't obvious to most. She was in her early 20s, finding her feet in adulthood. He was younger, bouncing between hospitals and home, sometimes fragile, sometimes intense. He relied on her, but failed to see that Nancy struggled too. You see, Nancy suffered from hearing impairment since birth, and she had to wear hearing aids. This specific feature made Nancy, who was a beautiful young woman by all accounts, prone to self-confidence issues. But she was tough. She was learning how to manage her problems and issues and navigate her life. She had even started dating and had found a steady job. She also had gotten her new apartment, which was a total game changer for her. Nancy had decorated her Toronto apartment in a warm, classic style with family antiques, soft lighting, and artwork. Friends described it as her refuge from the public life of being an Eaton. The irony is painful. It was meant to be her sanctuary, but it became the site of her murder. Andrew's life was not going in the direction he wanted it to. Recounts of his life tell the story of hospital stays, diagnoses that were at times unclear to the public, and a pattern of instability. He had been in and out of psychiatric care. Neighbors and extended family remembered odd behavior, mood swings, periods of withdrawal, and other times of volatility. On several occasions, he had even attacked his own mom, which made his parents wash their hands off him. They simply didn't know what to do with him. But to Nancy, this was someone she could soothe, someone she could offer kindness to. Even when Nancy became an adult, the two used to go back to the cottage just to hang out and be together. After all, he was like her little brother. They spent every summer together, bonding, swimming, and playing. Those who knew them would later describe the dynamic almost in the language of guardianship. Nancy supporting, Andrew leaning. Summer memories, days at the lake, nights around bonfires, acquired poignancy in retrospect. But beyond informal description, there were already institutional signs. The boy had a file, clinicians had notes, and the path that led to January 1985 had already been sketched in clinical corridors long before the fatal night. Nancy tried to help. After his own parents disowned him, started taking trips without him, and left him to fend for himself, Nancy welcomed him to her house. She let him take the couch. She even lent him her car and didn't mind when he broke into her car in the middle of the night to sleep. She was the friend everyone wants and needs. Nancy's mom warned her about what people said. She warned her that this friendship wouldn't end well. She had heard that he was unwell and uncontrollable, and she didn't want her only daughter exposed to a person who could hurt her in any way. Here we move into the hour that breaks everything. On January 21st, 1985, Nancy's mother climbed to her daughter's apartment and found the door unlocked after calling her many times and Nancy not picking up. This wasn't like Nancy. The mother and daughter were so close that they called each other at 8 a.m. on the dot every single morning to talk and catch up before starting their days. But she hadn't called, and she hadn't picked up. The home was not the scene of a random intruder. Investigators would later conclude the violence had a personal dimension, that someone close had been present. When officers arrived at Nancy's apartment, the scene was so horrific that one responding officer reportedly said it was, quote, like walking into a horror movie. There was blood on the walls, the carpet, and even splattered across furniture. Her injuries were so extensive that initial responders couldn't immediately recognize her. They had to confirm her identity through personal effects. Nancy had been stabbed repeatedly. Reports state she suffered 21 stab wounds. She had also been sexually assaulted either post-mortem or in the very final moments of her life. The blunt facts, the number of wounds, the nature of the injuries are shocking in their bluntness. But as investigators sifted through the apartment, they also looked for motive, for sign. Why someone she knew? After stabbing Nancy, Andrew left her body in her apartment. He had tried to clean up the scene but failed. There was blood everywhere. He left behind traces of his own bloody footprints. Andrew then took Nancy's credit cards and her car keys and drove away in her black BMW. He then drove aimlessly around Toronto for several hours. He used her credit card to buy gas and cigarettes. He eventually went back to his own apartment, which he shared with several roommates, but his behavior was erratic, nervous, disheveled. At one point, he reportedly showed a roommate a knife and said, quote, I killed Nancy. The roommate thought he was joking at first, until Andrew added details only the killer would know. He hid the bloody knife and some of his clothes in his apartment and later in a dumpster. Before leaving, he covered her body partially with a blanket, but there was no attempt to conceal the crime beyond that. The next morning, he visited his psychiatrist. According to reports from the later trial, he confessed during that session to having murdered Nancy. His psychiatrist immediately called the police after he left. Police tracked Andrew down to his apartment later that day. When police arrived, they found him in a dazed, detached state, with Nancy's blood still on some of his belongings. He was arrested without resistance and charged with first-degree murder. In custody, he reportedly spoke in fragments, saying things like, "I didn't mean to hurt her," and "she was my best friend." He also gave confused accounts about voices and feeling that Nancy was mocking him, consistent with what later psychologists diagnosed as paranoid schizophrenia. But did he understand what he had done? Was he criminally responsible, or was the product of mental illness so profound it had severed his connection to moral agency? To Nancy's family, the answer seems simple. A life had been taken, period. To Andrew's defense, the story was more complicated. A young man battling an organic brain dysfunction, psychiatric illness, and the kinds of symptoms that can leave someone unable to form intent in the way our criminal law requires. The court would have to parse through claims. The nation would watch. The legal record is sometimes a dry thing. Dates of arraignment, names of judges, evaluative reports. But here those records contain the heart of a debate about responsibility, culpability, and public safety. Andrew admitted to killing Nancy. He also admitted, in essence, to being unwell. Psychiatric experts were called. Some argued he suffered from severe and persistent mental disorder that impaired his ability to understand and appreciate the nature and consequences of his act. Others argued he had sufficient awareness to be held criminally responsible. The trial moved into the territory that every justice system dreads and respects at once. Not guilty by reason of insanity. The jury, informed by psychiatric testimony and by the legal test for criminal responsibility, concluded that Andrew's mental state at the time met the threshold for being found not criminally responsible, that is, legally insane. He was therefore indefinitely remanded to the custody of Ontario's Review Board rather than sentenced to a typical prison term. He was sent to a maximum security psychiatric hospital, specifically Penetanguishene Mental Health Care, Ontario. He was only 17 years old. This outcome generated immediate emotional heat. For Nancy's family and for many in the public, the verdict felt like a partitioning of justice. The killer had admitted the act. Yet the legal result was not the familiar closure of a prison sentence. Instead, it invoked psychiatric custody, periodic review, and sometimes the slow, bureaucratic progress of hospital wards and review hearings. Over the years, Andrew's case would appear in public conversations, petitions for leave, hearings about conditional release, board debates about safety and compassion, about rehabilitation and the limits of blame. In 2001, the CBC covered a hearing where his desires for increased freedom were discussed. The story reawakened public interest in the case. By the early 2000s, he was living under supervised release, though still under the jurisdiction of Ontario's Review Board. No public crime exists in a vacuum. The Eden family was both private sorrow and very public legacy. Their grief played out under the media's lens, headlines after headlines, the discomfort of privacy lost, the way the press frames tragedy into digestible narratives. For Nancy's mother and father, the wound was both intensely personal and also a public story about a family name. They had to navigate police interviews, press inquiries, and the slow, bureaucratic pace of a legal system that speaks in hearings and reports. For the Eden clan, the murder invited uncomfortable questions about safety, social circles, and the vulnerability that privilege does not prevent. The media also shaped the narrative of Andrew's mental illness. Some outlets emphasized the human tragedy of a boy failed by systems. Others emphasized the risk to the public. A movie would later dramatize the case. A book, called A Question of Guilt, would dig into the courtroom drama and the melancholy questions surrounding intent and insanity. Those cultural artifacts would keep the case in the public mind, but they would also simplify, dramatize, and sometimes sensationalize a story that, at its core, is unbearably complex. So, Nancy Eaton, what can we reasonably say? She was described as generous, socially engaged, someone who gave hospitality and warmth. Psychologically, people who adopt caretaking roles in relationships can become magnets for the emotionally fragile. That doesn't mean they cause harm. It simply means their empathy can be exploited. For Nancy, kindness was an ordinary trait. Tragically, kindness is not a shield. In many narratives of victimization, the person who offers help often does so from a place of autonomy and strength. And in that giving, they risk exposure to someone else's pathology. And Andrew Lation Hughes? The profile is harder to compress into tidy phrases, but the public record points to a long history of psychiatric difficulty. The medical testimony in the trial and the later analysis suggest diagnoses that included severe mood and cognitive disturbances, and according to some experts, sign of organic brain impairment. Where Andrew's pathology matters is in the way it shapes perception. Delusions, dissociation, and impaired insight can change how the world is experienced. A person may commit violent acts without the subjective sense of deliberate malicious intent if their capacity for understanding or control is compromised. The legal doctrine of insanity tries to capture this division. Did the accused understand the nature and quality of the act, and did they know it was wrong? Those are normative philosophical questions dressed in clinical language. Psychiatric experts test for signs of psychosis, cognitive impairment, and memory gaps. In Andrew's case, the experts convinced the court that his mental state at the time met the legal standard for not criminally responsible. But psychology asks not only about diagnosis, it asks about relational dynamics. Why did Nancy, a woman in her 20s, become the center of this young man's life in a way that put her at risk? Part of the answer lies in proximity and empathy. When families live in the same seasonal circles, children from different households develop bonds that outlast seasons. Another part lies in the social scripts of caretaking. Nancy may have responded to need with generosity, not with suspicion. There is also the chilling phenomenon of attachment and dependency. Some clinically disturbed individuals become fixated on caretakers, and under severe mental disturbance can shift from dependency to controlling or violent expression. The flip from affection to aggression is a clinical pattern sometimes seen in severe personality disturbance or psychosis. The loved one becomes a projection surface for rage, paranoia, or other disturbed impulses. Finally, the public debate around Andrew's release or conditional freedom highlights tensions central to forensic psychiatry: rehabilitation versus public safety, compassion versus retribution, the slow non-binary work of evaluating risk. Psychiatrists must balance evidence. How has the patient progressed? Are symptoms controlled? Is there insight? Can conditional community placement be managed safely? These are the same questions that guided review boards when Andrew's case came before them over the years. The Nancy Eaton case does not give us comfortable answers. It instead leaves us with the haunting, necessary questions. How do we protect the vulnerable, both victims and mentally ill offenders? How do we balance compassion with safety? How do families grieve when the person who committed a violent crime is also someone a loved one tried to help? The case forces us to confront the limits of our institutions, clinical, legal, familial, and the ways human tragedy resists easy resolutions. Nancy's story is also a reminder that kindness can be a kind of risk, that social circles are porous, that privilege does not immunize anyone against violence. It's also a reminder of the human cost of psychiatric breakdown. A young man's life will forever be shadowed by the act he committed, just as Nancy's life was cut short. If there is any solace in this story, it is the communal one: to learn, to improve systems, to teach caution without breeding fear, to remember victims without flattening them into footnotes. Nancy was more than an heiress or a headline. She was a person, and in remembering the contours of her life, we resist allowing the world to reduce her to the manner of her death. Thank you for listening to this episode of Crime Alley Documentaries. If this story moved you, consider sharing it with someone who cares about justice, psychology, or the quiet headlines of human fragility. This is your host signing off. Until next time, stay curious and take care of one another.